The war was over, but the echo of the Third Reich lingered in the offices where the future was being decided. Between 1946 and 1948, the Schleswig-Holstein Parliament experimented with how to speak about the past, naming it, archiving it, forgetting it. Soon, tension arose between closing the chapter on political purges and returning to normality, even if it meant silencing the uncomfortable. The regime was presented as a transient episode. There was a push to accelerate denazification, limit guilt, and promote reconciliation. With a bureaucracy full of former officials, the ground was set for amnesties, reintegrations, and pensions for regime functionaries. Schleswig-Holstein led this final point. In the records, the crimes were diluted into those things, while reparations to victims arrived too late. The imbalance extended to the families of the leaders. Widows and wives received lenient classifications, aid, and pensions that polished their past trajectories. The new state prioritized continuity and stability over justice. This raises the central question: how did the politics of the past become politics of forgetting? And what did it mean for women close to power? We will see detentions, transfers, and interrogations, the practical closure of denazification. This final point was constructed in regional parliaments. In Kiel, by the 1960s, the government attributed the crimes to a ruthless leadership. The opposition separated guilt from error, and everyone agreed on a comfortable narrative: deviation by a few, not collective failure. Language reinforced this view. Reparations were described as goodwill, not obligation. A former judge of the Volksgerichtshof joked about stripping rights from SS leaders, eliciting laughter. No one mentioned specific facts. The focus was on stability and the reintegration of officials. Denazification became a formality. The 1951 laws and the 1961 debates closed the process, followed by decades of silence. Officials regained positions and pensions, and the families of the former power normalized their lives with lenient files. It was not until the 1980s that the parliament revisited the issue, expanding funds and recognition for victims, although the post-war structure remained intact. Preserving the state took precedence over dismantling its entrenched habits. While the major trials offered exemplary memory, in practice another reality was taking shape. Wives and widows found legal loopholes and institutional support, not because the horror was ignored, but because political language had shifted the moral center. After the first interrogations, the post-war period took form. Cells, judicial corridors, and files weighed down with names. In Nuremberg, the leaders rehearsed alibis, feigned modesty, historical destiny, the mistakes of others. Self-defense and coldness set the tone. Meanwhile, their families were arrested, transferred, and classified. The system sought information, neutralized networks, and processed files. Between Nuremberg and the Allied headquarters, an administrative language emerged that normalized the treatment of families. In the cells, justifications were born: devotion to the leader as a spell, aggression as political calculation, or denial of anti-Semitism. In this way, guilt was concentrated on the decision-makers while the surrounding environment was exonerated. Wives appeared in local offices under forms that measured risk and information. The process was brief: arrest, interview, and lenient classification. From the offices, leaders insisted they were orders. We didn't know. Vertical obedience reduced guilt to a few and cleansed the structure. Outside the bars, the pattern persisted. Officials shifted responsibility. Clerks reduced violence to procedure. Guards treated it as routine. If there was no risk or involvement, the case was closed quickly. Without evidence of active membership, wives received the most benign classifications. The leaders, meanwhile, crafted narratives of honor and obedience, while the wives lived in suspense until their reintegration. From 1945 to 1948, the priority was to close fronts and stabilize territories. In their closing statements, Wilhelm Frick defended the Nuremberg laws as scientific principles. Rosenberg spoke of natural law. Göring presented himself as a patriot. Ribbentrop denied anti-Semitism. Streicher reinforced his own image. Outside the courtroom, Funk acknowledged moral guilt. Keitel appealed to superior orders. Kaltenbrunner attributed the killings to Himmler. The Kielce pogrom rekindled prejudices. Frank claimed that ordinary justice was sufficient. Streicher, grotesque, mixed figures and stereotypes, a prelude to the prosecution's rebuttal. Von Schirach broke ranks and repudiated Nazism. Göring maneuvered to isolate him. The Malmedy verdict strained the military bloc. Keitel defended Piper. Jodl awaited milder precedents. The old hierarchy was sliding blame downward. Then, a reading of the Herald Tribune sparked hope. Frictions between Washington and Moscow suggested a new chessboard. Göring and Ribbentrop celebrated the Western Division. Hess nodded silently. At that moment, Robert Jackson intervened, summarizing months of evidence. Göring, half militarist, half gangster; Ribbentrop, purveyor of appeasement; Keitel, obedient tool; Rosenberg, liturgy of hatred; Streicher, racial pornography; Sauckel, mass slavery. The reaction was indignation and complaints of demagoguery. Sir Hartley Shawcross continued, from the map of power to the materiality of crime, hair, rings, mass graves. What dispensation kept these men ignorant, he asked. Silence. That night, Ribbentrop wrote nervous defenses. Göring tallied his mentions. Streicher proclaimed admiration for Jewish determination without abandoning denial. The contrast between papers and graves, alibis and figures had been laid bare. While prosecutors dismantled alibis in Nuremberg, another story was being written quietly: the domestic diary of Margarete Himmler. Born in 1893 in West Prussia, a nurse and divorcee, she ran a small sanatorium in Berlin until meeting Heinrich Himmler in 1926, 7 years her junior. Despite family opposition, they married in 1928. She sold the clinic, they bought a house near Munich, and established a farm while he rose in the party. In 1929, their daughter Gudrun, nicknamed Puppy, was born. Shortly afterward, they adopted Gerhard, whom the diary scarcely mentions with affection. Her husband's career rose precipitously, head of the SS, responsible for the police in Bavaria and then across the Reich, chief of the Gestapo and the concentration camps. This power barely appears in her diary. After moving to Berlin in 1934, Margarete settled with Gudrun in Gmund, while Pappy lived between trains, offices and headquarters. From 1940, the notebook reflects Himmler's relationship with his secretary, Hedwig Potthast, mother of 2 children. Notes reveal the wound and instability of someone clinging to her daughter, the house, and routine. Net, pleasant, repeats like a shield. There was no public rupture. He continued sending flowers and attending celebrations. Her pages mix protocol, political devotion, and learned anti-Semitism, without doubt. A party member, she always trusted the Führer. She visited ghettos that reinforced her prejudices, and like other SS wives, benefited from confiscated property. In 1937, she accompanied her husband to Italy and recorded with delight the restaurants, museums and ruins, oblivious to the war. In 1938, she describes her husband's fatigue, bridge games and pride in Hitler's oratory. From home, she follows the annexation of Austria, radio on and phone lines open from Vienna, spring in Gmund, exhausting trips, family Easter, and an absent husband. She prepares a women's excursion to Italy, only to have it frustrated as it turns into a wives' gathering. At the end of summer, she celebrates 10 years of marriage alone. The Nuremberg ritual surrounds her with flowers and confidences, but soon come the nerves of Munich and Godesberg. She waits in Berlin while he travels. Relief at avoiding war coexists with fatigue and unease. In Salzburg, she complains about her health and a house never up to standard. In March 1939, she follows the entry into Prague, takes pride in the new chancellery and Gerhard's progress. In August, the pact with Moscow unsettles her environment. Ration cards arrive and fear of the word war spreads. In September, she establishes an auxiliary hospital in Berlin, bids her daughter farewell in tears, and clashes with senior doctors. Autumn brings new titles for Himmler and a pride that cannot conceal the weariness. Amid intrigues, formal dinners and card games, he travels to Posen, Łódź and Warsaw, where he describes misery and entrenched prejudices without hesitation. Lack of order. By the end of 1940, she confesses feeling lonely and abandons the infirmary. In 1941, with sporadic calls from Norway or Greece, her spirits declined. A domestic accident landed her in the emergency room. Later, she boasted of splendid advances in the east and complained about the neighborhood. In the fall, she reported maneuvers against her within the Red Cross, yet continued receiving visits and gifts. Everything went very well. The following year began with fragile health and persistent cold. She sympathized with the soldiers, defended the leader, and enjoyed a few days with Heinrich and Gudrun. By summer, her discontent erupted. Lies, intrigues, exhaustion. In Mitau, she fell ill after a vaccination, received SS commissioners and surgeons, and attended the parade celebrating the liberation. Stalingrad marked a turning point. She wrote less and less. The facts weigh heavily. She wanted to believe in someone again and clung to her daughter. In September, nearing 50, she insisted that Germany could not fall. She recorded her husband's promotion to interior and believed he could save them. She blamed herself for not being in her post. The new year found her distributing clothes to bombing victims. On July 20th, 1944, she called the assassination attempt against Hitler a shame, thanked God that he was alive, and returned to her distribution post. Sirens interrupted the day. Family life persisted through letters and brief visits. In December, she celebrated a minimal Christmas Eve with Gudrun and neighbors. Tensions with Heinrich's brother resurfaced, but she maintained courtesy. She sent her daughter to boarding school for safety and stayed in Gmund because he wants it. With the front now in Germany, she noted that her husband was directing operations in the West and would know how to resolve them. In February 1945, she wrote that he was called to great tasks. 3 weeks later, she recorded that the castle had become a hospital, Gudrun had returned to school, Gerhard was serving in Brno with the SS, and everything remained very serious. This parallel world of Margarete Himmler raises the larger question: how does a society confront or postpone its past? In post-war Germany, this task was named with a harsh word: taking responsibility for what happened. Already in the 1950s, Adorno doubted the willingness to acknowledge responsibility. Settling accounts, he said, was not clarification, but turning the page and, if possible, erasing it. Asking for forgiveness and forgetting was the demand of those who had caused the harm. By the mid-century, memory appeared as a shifting process shaped by the political and cultural climate. There was no single path. Each generation, class, gender or racial group faced its own dilemmas, conditioned by family and state, new human rights norms, and an interdependent economy. As goals changed, so did values, methods, and scales. Immediately after the surrender, the ground was claimed by both victors and the defeated. Courts, prosecutor offices, military bodies, and bureaucracies of purge and restitution. The occupation decade sought to expel totalitarianism. Nuremberg held the leaders accountable. Historians established facts, strategies, victims, and the roots of anti-Semitism. Psychologists explored the authoritarian personality. Citizens were called to commemorate and to overcome the inability to mourn, even if focus often remained on mere survival. With the Cold War, a divided Germany, and poorly executed denazifications, the emphasis shifted. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, priorities turned to political re-education, institutional reforms, cleansing of language, and dismantling of myths. Churches and expellee associations intervened, demanding reparations for German suffering. In the 1960s and 1970s, Israeli intelligence services, the World Jewish Congress, memorials, museums, and documentation centers joined the effort. The aim was to consolidate democratic institutions and civic symbols. By the late 1970s, the Holocaust series catalyzed a shift in the Bundestag regarding the statutory provisions for murder and mass killings. In the 1980s, voices calling for recognition of all victims grew stronger. On May 8, 1985, Richard von Weizsäcker named the persecuted, Roma and Sinti, homosexuals, the ill conscientious objectors, churches, trade unionists, communists, socialists and resistors, and recalled the suffering of women, whose resignation and strength prevented spiritual collapse. Educators influenced by 1968 brought this education into classrooms. Youth exchanges with Poland and Israel took place, alongside the Historikerstreit, the Goldhagen debate, and a growing civic humanitarian ecosystem, albeit with few feminist historians. In the GDR, official anti-fascism limited free debate about the Shoah and personal guilt, though Nazism was treated more systematically in schools serving socialism. Communist resistors were integrated into the narrative. After the Berlin Wall fell, the first free parliament, with many Lutheran pastors, apologized for hostility toward Israel. Following reunification, xenophobic attacks in East and West Germany, Hoyerswerda, Rostock, Mölln, Solingen, added new objectives, transmitting historical responsibility, compensating for the loss of history among youth, and assuming regional peace tasks. The learning gap widened as the Western narrative imposed the label of SED dictatorship. The instruments combined punishment, atonement and restitution, criminal and civil, national and individual, financial and symbolic, with uneven results. By the late 1990s, the Social Democratic Green government redefined moral rehabilitation. In addition to plaques, economic recognition was granted to excluded groups, such as forced laborers. Payments were more symbolic than compensatory. Guiding idea: each era receives the settling of accounts it can bear. Freddie Diamond contrasted politics as a matter of life and death, from his biography as a Viennese Jew, with cold, calculated models. If women were long left on the sidelines, their ways of remembering produced different conclusions. There is an urgent need to examine memory with a gender perspective. In the 1990s, the review expanded to allied and neutral countries. States that believed themselves innocent were brought to court, especially in the United States, as accessory participants in Nazi crimes, even if their populations were later. The list of unprosecuted was long and included many women. Some did not answer, others received symbolic sentences. The only woman in the cabinet, Gertrude Scholz-Klink, was briefly convicted for evading occupation, not conspiracy. Wealthy figures such as Winifred Wagner, Carola Hoffmann, Helene Bechstein, Elsa Bruckmann contributed contacts, money, property and social capital in the 1920s to 1930s, making Hitler presentable in elite salons. Others, secretaries, chroniclers, filmmakers, remained minor figures with truncated careers or suicides. Few manuals assign them a decisive role. The bias was not only judicial. In 1993, the inaugural Congress of the Holocaust Museum in Washington included dozens of panels: racial ideology, public health, ordinary men, churches, observers, black people and homosexuals, but none on women or gender. When this was pointed out, the response was, "It slipped our mind." Experiences differ. From the Nuremberg laws onward, many Jewish men lost jobs and fled before the final solution, leaving women and children more exposed to raids and deportations. With local networks, practical languages and flexible support, they, as Marion Kaplan has emphasized, reskilled themselves, sustained households, shared rations at the cost of their health, and in the camps sometimes survived through that forced bodily economy. Motherhood added cruelty. Pregnancy meant an immediate sentence. Too many accompanied their children to death. For years, dividing suffering by gender seemed offensive. Today, female memories, diaries, letters and drawings are incorporated, with cases from Łódź, the passing as Aryans, subcultures in Theresienstadt or Birkenau, and resistance in forests or French networks. The existence of two Germanys hindered a feminism capable of addressing the national past. Since the mid-1990s, young female researchers have asked what mothers and grandmothers did, and supported. Some protagonists publicly admitted their conscious support. This shift leads to Gerda Bormann, wife of Hitler's secretary, marked by fierce loyalties and programmed silences, whose life illustrates the female support sustaining the machinery of power. The Absent Half forces a review of common narratives. Wives and widows of wealthy businessmen introduced Hitler into respectable circles, providing financial backing, property and respectability, while the ideal of the submissive woman was exalted. Scholz-Klink, Reich women's leader, ensured that women fulfilled roles, to procreate for the Reich and work without pay. She claimed that the wooden spoon weapon should count as a rifle. After the war, detained and stripped of rights, she never admitted guilt and remained connected to neo-Nazi circles. Magda Goebbels, close to Hitler, crowned her loyalty with the final crime. In April 1945, she poisoned her 6 children and committed suicide with Joseph Goebbels. Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, typed his will and decades later admitted shared guilt. Ilse Schmidt, a Wehrmacht secretary, witnessed deportations and executions in Serbia and Ukraine. In later life, she recounted what she saw to warn about everyday complicity. These destinies range from militant denial, Scholz Klink, to despair, Magda Goebbels, from belated shame, Junge, to silent resistance, Schmidt, while millions of anonymous female prisoners endured the system's direct side, the camps and forced labor. Meanwhile, the battle over the narrative was being fought. Over the decades, settling accounts shifted from a victor's dossier to a moving process. Generations reformulate questions and moral frameworks. Through a gender lens, the master history reveals a persistent bias. Female experience entered late and often with a borrowed voice. For victimized women, remembering was both identity and survival. Intimate rituals, preserved dates, whispered words, a memory anchored in the domestic sphere while public debate drifted into abstractions. Working through the past requires time, security, and institutions. Inequality in the private sphere makes it a chimera, as Adorno had already intuited. Even so, intergenerational transmission opened cracks. The 60-70 schools, media, protest re-examined women's roles from complicit cogs to silent resistance. This voice seeks connections, not absolution, an ethics of everyday resistance as recalled by Marion Dunhoff and Alice Schwarzer. It contrasts with a present where cost-benefit calculations colonize memory, belated compensation, insufficient funds for female forced labor, especially in agriculture and domestic service, and a morality of payment that trivializes harm. Meanwhile, the public use of the past became instrumentalized, inflated metaphors, flawed analogies, and disputes over monuments that substitute for substance. The double risk, diluting extermination into spectacle and reactivating trauma in old age, nightmares, automatic gestures at a white coat or a piece of bread, without those around understanding this code of fear. Urgent questions remain: how to effectively recognize female forced labor ignored by reparations, how to reopen intergenerational conversations to avoid slogans, how to translate Arendt's thinking into everyday civic practice, and above all, how to reclaim women as subjects of memory, not only victims but also agents, to read their place within the Reich's machinery. If in Gerda Bormann private life orbited power, for Emmy Göring that orbit was state spectacle. The courtly title of High Lady soon circulated for her, provoking mockery among old colleagues and a fatal denunciation. Soprano Helene von Weinmann was arrested for insulting her, beaten, and sentenced to 3 years of forced labor. After 1945, Emmy maintained that neither she nor her husband had encouraged the title, and that it emerged from the people, although it aligned with Himmler's plans to create schools of great and elevated women with that rank. Born in Hamburg, the daughter of a chocolate industry entrepreneur, she grew up without financial pressure and with a passion for theatre. With her mother's support and a condition to learn domestic tasks, she earned a scholarship after an audition with Leopold Gessner. At 18, she signed on in Aussig. In Munich, she met the actor Karl Köstlin, and they married in Trieste during the war. After the armistice, she performed in Vienna, Stuttgart, and Wiesbaden. The marriage broke down with the peace. In 1922, she secured a contract at the Weimar National Theatre. She remained a repertory face for a decade. In early 1932, after an event, Hitler and his entourage entered the Actors' Café. There she met Hermann Göring, whom she initially mistook for Goebbels. Newly orphaned of her mother, she was struck by the devotion with which he recalled Karin, his deceased wife. From Capri, Göring telegraphed his affection. A walk through Weimar sealed the relationship. In Berlin, she saw Göring's luxury, lavish residences, tapestries, ancestral castles. At Karin Hall, she was introduced as his private secretary. Tall and blonde, she fit the Nordic mold he idealized. She embraced the cult of Karin, a shrine room, boats named Karin I and II. Her own cabin came later in 1936. They spent Christmas together. On January 30th, 1933, with Hitler's rise, she witnessed the torch parade from the Kaiserhof, carrying a revolver in her bag in case something broke out. A month later, the Reichstag burned. Emmy defended Göring's innocence with a domestic alibi, photos of Karin. Historiography has ruled him out as the author, but the regime had already used the fire for repression. On April 11th, Göring was appointed Minister-President of Prussia, and Emmy's career shifted. Entry into Berlin's main theatre with Schlageter, in 1934, filming William Tell. In February 1935 came the proposal, an Easter wedding with Hitler as witness. Göring presented it as the Führer's wish to marry those at the top. Her public persona blended power and artifice, shoulder pads, manicures, tailored suits, and addiction to opiates. While Emmy later wrote that the camps were re-education and that her husband abhorred abuses, the chronology tells another story: orders to fire without mercy, creation of the Gestapo, participation in the SA Purge, hostility toward Jewish businesses, and defense of extra-legal justice. On April 10, 1935, Berlin became an imperial stage. Marching bands, decorated buildings, 30,000 soldiers, a parade, orchids from Hitler, promises to grant any request. After the ceremony at the Dom, a squadron flew over the city. Correspondents described the wedding as imperial. This event cemented Emmy's public role, and her title endured. The coronation continued with a church service and banquet at the Kaiserhof. The following day, gifts were displayed. Museums contributing pieces, city halls emptying boxes, corporations and governments competing in grandeur. When Emmy tried to downplay this luxury in 1948, memories returned of her arrival at the Vienna Opera in ermine and jewels during the war. Rumors circulated, pamphlets alleging a non-Aryan past and a relationship with a Jew. The courts punished the slander, and the official genealogy omitted her first marriage. It was said that Göring was infertile, but in June 1938, Edda was born. Hitler accepted symbolic paternity, and the Luftwaffe acted as godparent. The baptism took place at Karin Hall with mountains of gifts, including a Cranach Madonna taken from a museum. The home became a Baroque principality. Karin Hall expanded with a cinema, an armory, and a monumental salon. Summers included ballet and a recreated prater. Dangerous whims appeared. Lion cubs roamed the halls. Beneath the splendor lay plunder, lists of tapestries, paintings, and furniture reserved across half of Europe sent to Karin Hall. Voluntary gifts for the child. Outside, popularity endured. He, a jovial marshal; she, a gracious hostess who occasionally interceded for Jewish friends without challenging the system. Her denazification record included honorary party membership, affiliation with the NS Frauenschaft, and ideological alignment. Her assistance did not stem from political opposition. From 1939, Göring's real power declined. His economic plan failed, the Luftwaffe faltered in England, and the Stalingrad disaster broke him. Retreat to Karinhal and Weldenstein increased. The war besieged the stage set. In early 1945, with the front in the Schorfheide, Emmy and Edda fled to the Obersalzberg. A special train hid 1,000 paintings and tapestries in a tunnel in the Untersberg, Bavaria. On April 23, 1945, misled by an erroneous report, he telegraphed offering to succeed Hitler. The response was arrest for high treason and confinement of the family in the Berghof's underground bunkers. After Hitler's suicide in Berlin, they were transferred to Mautendorf. On May 7th, Göring was taken into custody by the Americans. Emmy was arrested later, separated from Edda, spent months in Straubing as a witness for Nuremberg, and lived a minimal existence in a nearby cabin. In September 1946, she was authorized to visit him, brief meetings through glass, the child reciting verses. Emmy encouraged him not to ask for clemency. On the night before the execution, a cyanide capsule spared the gallows. She admitted she was aware of its existence. Internments and records followed, not political, but honorary member and beneficiary of ostentation. The Spruchkammer classified her as an opportunist of the regime, with partial confiscation of property, 1 year of labor already served, and 5 years of professional prohibition. Public opinion was divided. The battle over objects continued. The Cranach Madonna, jewelry, tapestries, porcelain. Emmy claimed donations. Lawsuits lasted years and often favored Edda. Emmy reconstructed a discreet routine in Munich. In 1967, she published memoirs portraying her husband as generous and the country as idyllic, without looting or violence. By then, the Hohe Frau oscillated between gracious hostess and widow unwilling or unable to face the abyss. Disputed accounts and objects remained, while she insisted on distancing herself from politics, and the echo of celebrations and frozen tunnels continued to pulse, awaiting the next turn in the narrative. And as the brilliance of Karin-Hall's salons faded among the ruins, another scene began in the other Germany: how to come to terms with what had happened. For years, the focus rested on official gestures and solemn speeches, yet that top-down view left society as mere spectators, as if the messages of power met no resistance, doubt, or silence in those who received them. Practices of remembering and forgetting arose in everyday life, in bodies marked by pain or comfort, shaping what could be said and what was prudent to remain unspoken. Two voices lay bare this imbalance. A Hungarian Jewish woman spared from the gas because she was assigned to a munitions factory in Hesse carried decades of migraines, startled responses, and nightmares. Upon returning to her country, she was not even considered for the supposed compensation schemes. Just a few meters away, and at the same age, a German nurse would later swear she had not seen those prisoners, until she admitted that she had seen them and looked away. The distance between these experiences, and the physical proximity linking them, reveals a form of memory sustained by habits, fears, and conveniences. In 1979, a US television series about the destruction of a Jewish family broke into prime time in West Germany, and for a few nights disrupted the detached posture of viewers. After each episode, telephone lines were overwhelmed, thousands of people crying, asking how it could have happened, who had taken the houses and businesses, what the railway workers transporting the trains had done. Invited historians attempted to return the debate to the realm of books and statistics. The emotional flood, however, pointed to other hidden memories outside the classroom and archive. This rupture coexisted with an institutional framework that, since 1945, had been closing its gates. Denazification in the Western zones became a machinery of forms that classified the vast majority as mere followers, a label that functioned as social absolution and halted uncomfortable moral questions. At the same time, diaries and sermons proclaimed never again, while under the banner of national disaster, a narrative of self-victimization took hold. Adorno warned in 1959, settling accounts with the past had become an excuse to declare it closed. His prescription, more awareness, more clarification, relied on pedagogical brigades. He did not see or could not fully grasp to what extent the smallest everyday gestures reproduced and simultaneously distorted these structures of obedience. Between rational pedagogy and the silent weight of habits, the question returned with a sharper edge: who chose not to look, who could have looked and did not, who learned to live with that choice? We return to the starting point, as seen in biographies and the margins, the rise of a regime sustained by salon courtesies, bureaucratic signatures, and daily obedience, the agency of women who were both cogs and mirrors of their time, the slow civic pedagogy that, after defeat, sought to translate guilt into institutions and mourning into ritual, and in the background the uncomfortable question: what does a society do with what it knows about itself? Life around power, in palaces, offices, dressing rooms, showed that evil does not only march, it also poses, writes letters, organizes parties, sets schedules, designs uniforms. In those rooms, respectability was manufactured, and from there, the violence others would suffer without witnesses was normalized. At the same time, the accounts of those close to the core, yet without thinking, revealed how proximity, anesthesia, and routine absolve. That slide, from astonishment to habit, is perhaps the harshest lesson. Then came the era of papers, trials, categories, anniversaries, monuments, necessary tools, yes, but often insufficient. There were gestures that opened conversation and policies that closed it, reparations that arrived late or only partially, new silences replacing the old. Memory was administered like a dossier, while blind alleys persisted. Who remained outside the narrative, who paid the lesser price, who continued calling a tragedy what had clear authors and beneficiaries. This journey leaves us with one certainty: history is not tamed with information, but with responsibility. To remember is not to list horrors, but to recognize connections between private decisions and public consequences, between symbols and their logistics, between the comfort of some and the exposure of others. The opposite of denial is not occasional outrage, but sustained civic vigilance that turns never again into criteria for today. In the classroom, in the workplace, on the street, in the law. It also offers a method. Look from below and from within. Observe bodies, habits, corridors, payrolls, letters, small favors. There the drift can be detected in time, when aesthetics replace ethics, when obedience overrides judgment, when belonging erases empathy. And it issues a warning: no society is immune. Crises are enough, leaders skilled at exploiting fears, and a majority willing to cede portions of conscience in exchange for security, status, or spectacle. Finally, one task remains unexpired: to integrate the past without neutralizing it, to make room for memories that still demand a place, and to uphold institutions that protect people before myths. If barbarism was possible in normality, prevention must also be every day, because the future is not inherited, it is watched. And memory, when taken seriously, is not a museum. It is a commitment that is still watching us.